right, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Treasure CRA. My name is Emily Rice, and if you don't know me, I am CEDAM's Communications and Training Associate. Here with me today is Mandy Wrinkle of the NCRC, and she's here to talk about the OCC's ANPR on the Community Reinvestment Act and how we can all take action to defend the CRA. Many of you on today's webinar are CEDAM members or partners, and we want to highly encourage all of you to send a personalized letter to the OCC, as this will have a huge impact on your work and on the communities you serve. So CEDAM is drafting a comment letter, which you'll be able to personalize with your organization's information and perspective. And Mandy has also provided us with NCRC's resources as well as instructions for submitting a letter, so we'll make sure all of that goes out after this webinar. Before we get started, I have everybody muted to reduce background noise. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat box as you have them, but we will get to all of those at the end. So just keep that in mind. And all right, I'll hand it off to you, Mandy.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Happy Halloween. As Emily said, my name is Mandy Wrinkle. I'm a Senior Regional Organizer with NCRC. NCRC stands for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and we're a grassroots member organization that works to create opportunities for people to build wealth. We do this by working with community leaders, policymakers, and financial institutions to champion fairness in banking and housing and business. We got our start in 1990 by bringing together national, regional, and local organizations to increase the flow of capital to private organizations and traditionally underserved communities. We've grown into an association of more than 600 community-based organizations that promote access to banking services, affordable housing, entrepreneurship, job creation, and vibrant communities for all Americans. So I just want to start out by going over our agenda today. This call will be pretty quick. I'd like to try and keep it at about 30 minutes because I want to respect everybody's time and leave some time for questions if anyone has any. We've already gone through our quick introduction of NCRC, so I'm going to move through and go through a quick review of the Community Reinvestment Act so that we all have at least a little bit of a base level of understanding. Do an overview of the Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking for this process, so the ANPR, and move to the call to action and overview of resources that we have available to help everybody make a comment on this important rulemaking process, and with some questions and suggestions and feedback. All right. So the CRA stands for the Community Reinvestment Act, which was passed in 1977 as a part of a series of legislative attempts to end discrimination by financing institutions, and specifically to address redlining in communities. This came out of a combination of a bunch of other really important legislative acts that came out around that time, including the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. What makes the CRA different is that it establishes a continuing and affirmative obligation for banks to meet the credit needs of its entire community, and doing so through a way that's consistent and safe and sound with the operations of the institution. So the CRA was really designed to be broad, flexible, and responsive to changes in communities. And it directs the regulatory agencies to evaluate the extent that the banks they oversee are meeting the credit needs for their communities. And those are the three different regulating agencies there: the Federal Reserve, the OCC, which is the organization that the department that put out the ANPR, and then the FDIC. So banks are examined, or CRA is operationalized through a CRA exam, and each bank undergoes 3 different tests. The lending test, which evaluates how well the bank is lending to LMI borrowers, or low to medium income borrowers, and neighborhoods through home mortgage, small business, and small farm loans. Community development lending is also evaluated here. Next, they go through an investment test, which evaluates the bank's investments that have community development purposes and whether they are innovative and responsive to the community's needs. So a lot of our members engage with banks because they have either a CDFI or a CDC, and so they're engaging through these different investment opportunities. The third part of the exam is the service test, which evaluates the bank's retail and community development services to their entire community. So when we talk about this, we're really talking a lot about bank branches, whether they're operating the service in an area that needs it, service hours, looking to see if the products that they're offering are the best fit for the community that they serve. And also offering the service test also includes other options like looking how the bank is interacting with local nonprofits, if they're offering technical assistance, offering other sort of supportive services. So all banks are examined using these 3 tests, but their size will determine the methods and the scope of the exam. And banks' CRA performance is measured in a bank's assessment area, which is basically the MSA or often counties where the bank has branches. So a bank's lending is really being, and those 3 tests are being evaluated based on its assessment area. So banks go through these exams every 3 to 4 years, and during that time they receive 1 of 4 ratings, either outstanding or satisfactory, which is considered passing, or needs for improvement or substantial noncompliance, which would be not passing. Ratings are taken into account when banks apply to merge or to acquire another bank, or when it wants to open another branch. So CR's framework for community engagement, again, because it was really designed in a way to be flexible and nimble, it leaves a lot of room for community input. Gail Cincoto, which is a founding leader of the CRA advocacy, says the full responsibility for CRA enforcement has always been the job of the people in the neighborhoods. So because of the way that these CRA exams are currently set up, community input is incredibly important. So the community can comment on how well a bank is meeting their CRA obligations. These comments can be submitted to a bank CRA file and taken into consideration during a bank CRA exam. The community can comment on a bank CRA performance during mergers or acquisitions, and regulators look at banks' prior CRA performance during the application process. And community members can also engage with banks and their regulators during a bank closure process to be able to advocate and talk about how that will impact their community. Lastly, communities can use these engagement opportunities to negotiate public benefit agreements and plans. And that's really where NCRC has been successful. Since 2016, NCRC and its members have utilized the CRA's community engagement mandate to negotiate 7 community benefit agreements. These agreements will put an extra $86 billion into underserved communities, as well as open 41 additional branches. Some of these banks include Fifth Third and Huntington, which I know touch the Michigan area, and because of an assessment area compiling into a CRA's review, that means that when we talk about these CBAs, we're often talking about the entire assessment area benefiting from the CBA. We currently have 18 members across the state of Michigan who have been able to engage in this process. We've also been able to get banks to stop funding payday lenders and create innovative philanthropic programs for minority, women, and immigrant-owned businesses. And community input is vital to identify the most pressing community needs. So by using these different leverage points and the process through the CRA exam process, we've been able to have more of an impact in saying how banks are meeting local needs and communities. So next I'm going to move into the ANPR process. So unlike other opportunities, this isn't a piece of legislation that we're commenting on. This is a part of the rulemaking process. So I know the diagram has got a lot of information there. We're at basically step 3. so we're still early on, but it's incredibly important for organizations and community leaders to know where we are. The advance notice of proposed rulemaking comes before the actual proposed rule and then after the final rule is established. So how did we get here? Over the last year, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency has made changes to CRA rules. They've done this a few different ways. One example is that the OCC has changed a rule making it difficult to downgrade a bank's CRA rating if they're caught in a questionable practice. An example of this is that Wells Fargo, as you might remember, went through, was made national news whenever it was released that they were opening bank accounts for individuals without their knowledge. Prior to the OCC's change of rules this last year, a bank could receive a downgrading on their CRA exam as a result when these sorts of things come to light. Not that that's no longer possible as the OCC has changed this rule, but it makes it incredibly more difficult. So this is, in a sense, has given us a nod that under this current administration, the OCC is wanting to really take a sharper look at the CRA. In April, the Treasury Department released a paper on its study of the CRA, making many recommendations on potential improvements. In September, the OCC released an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, or the ANPR, which is the beginning of the process for changing the rules of CRA. So this ANPR, what we're wanting to help engage people around and take advocacy on, it actually proposes 31 questions for the public to weigh in on concerning potential CRA reform. It's 6 pages long, roughly, and there's a lot of different questions, and it does this through a combination of both creating hypothetical situations, asking direct questions, and also giving some examples of what they would like to see changed. So why is this a big deal? We see many of these proposed changes as an attempt to weaken the CRA under the guise of modernization. If CRA is weakened, that means that low and moderate income individuals and neighborhoods in our communities will have less access to the capital and credit they need. Many of the proposed questions also move to diminish or remove community input from the evaluation process and make it much more of a formulaic, quantitative process. So next I'm going to talk through 6 different examples or points that we are really pushing hard against, just so you get a kind of more of an understanding of how it can potentially change CRA as we currently know it. As I said, there's 31 different questions, so there's a lot in there. So we're just going to focus on 6. The first example I have of something that we're really concerned about is that this idea that we call the 1 ratio. So the OCC has suggested using 1 ratio to determine a bank's CRA performance. That would look like this. There's a little diagram that's basically saying a bank's taking all the bank's lending to LMI borrowers and neighborhoods, plus all of their community development loans, plus all of their investments. So basically taking those 3 different tests, adding up all the money that they spent on that, plus their philanthropy, plus potentially anything else that comes out of this rulemaking process, and that's leaning towards the industry's interest, and dividing that by a bank's assets. So what we're concerned about is moving to this approach would allow banks to simply buy themselves into a passing CRA grade and allow them to ignore specific local needs or community needs. We're concerned that it gives banks more incentive to only invest in large dollar projects to fulfill their requirements quickly, rather than investing in small dollar projects that address specific community needs like credit repair, in-depth housing counseling, down payment assistance programs, or support for alternative banking and innovative ways to address payday lending. So, really it's setting up a way for banks to be able to see how to be able to buy themselves into a passing grade. Using this formula doesn't leave room for local comments or perspective. Remember those different engagement points that we talked about where communities can give feedback if we're moving to a formula-only system. And NCRC does not oppose the use of metrics. In fact, our mantra in our office is that data drives the movement. But we believe that a single metric should not be used to evaluate a bank's CRA performance because there's just too much that goes into it. We also see moving to a simple formula as a way to weaken public participation, and people working directly in the communities have the best insight into local needs and can really give the best perspective as to whether a bank is meeting those individual needs. The second example is about extending what counts. So the ANPR suggests monetizing CRA service hours so that what used to count as a single hour would now be multiplied by an average labor rate. So an example, let's say that a bank did 100 hours of CRA service. This could be participating on boards of nonprofits. This could be providing financial counseling to LMI communities. Could be a couple different things. And then let's say that the average labor rate of the bank's staff was determined to be $20 an hour. So if this rule was to change, the bank has turned basically 100 hours of service into 2,000 hours of service while offering no additional benefit to communities. In addition, we're talking about extending what counts. And our CRA was always intended to have a specific focus on LMI communities. And the ANPR is now suggesting reworking how banks get credit for specifically small business lending, suggesting that banks should get credit for all loans to businesses that meet the SBA small business standards, which vary widely by industry. So for example, if adopted, banks would now get CRA credit for loans to a used car dealership making $25 million a year because they are considered a small business under SBA standards. And what we would say is that SBA standards make a lot of sense for government contracting, but not getting at the credit needs of real small businesses in LMI communities. The ANPR also proposes expanding the scope of activities that qualify for CRA credit beyond how their work impacts LMI people and communities. So extending CRA credit for financial infrastructure, for financing infrastructure or hospitals that do not directly benefit LMI communities. Again, we don't oppose supporting the valuable services or overall community development, but the original intent of the CRA was to ensure that LMI communities and communities that of color that have been traditionally redlined have access to the capital and credit they need to be able to build wealth in their own communities. The third example that we're concerned about is this credit outside of assessment areas. So NCRC and others have pushed for the CRA to take into account a bank's lending outside of their assessment area. We've been pushing for this for many years with the modernization of banking. Everyone does, or a lot of people do a lot of online banking. We have fintech or corporations that are also operating in the space now. And the ANPR proposes, hello? Okay, I'm going to keep going. The ANPR proposes updating this practice, but suggests summing up all of these activities in aggregate. This is not how we want this to be carried out. We want additional assessment areas. If a bank is doing that much lending in an area, then regulators should be evaluating the lending to ensure that it's being responsive to local needs. So what we would say, instead of just adding all of the bank's lending up across all of its footprint or across where it's making lending, if a bank is doing, a bank that is doing that much lending outside of its assessment area, there should be an additional assessment area created to make sure that that lending is falling in line with CRA practices. And studies have found that banks lending in their assessment areas is less likely to result in foreclosure than lending done outside their assessment. So there is that accountability piece. Example 4 is about the importance of bank branches, and we would really push that they still matter. The ANPR openly asked if branches in LMI areas should be reviewed on a CRA evaluation, basically saying, do bank branches still matter? We say that de-emphasizing bank branches would mean less services for already underserved neighborhoods, and studies have shown that the harm that comes from when a branch loss has on home and small business lending. We understand that our NCRC understands that online banking plays an important role, but we cannot discredit the importance of local branches. Example 5 is data reporting. The ANPR asked kind of a very broad question about what data should be reported. And we've been saying for years that the public needs to be able to access information on banks' community development loans and investment activity in their communities on an annual basis, much like the HMDA data. And mortgage and small business lending, as I said, is already reported in this way. So it's a way to be able to hold banks more accountable. The last example I want to talk about is really this idea of what we think is missing. As a part of this ANPR process, we really do think that there is a lot of room for growth, but these are some things that we think that community advocates have been advocating for a while that haven't even been considered as a part of the potential reform process. So ANPR does not address several crucial issues that really could strengthen CRA. The first and biggest one is that race. It's time that CRA exams include an analysis of bank lending to different racial groups, as the law was originally intended. We want community benefit agreements to be recognized as a part of a CRA exam process, because we really feel that that is a great example and shows how well a bank is engaging with the community and being responsive to its needs. We also we want to question and push back on the idea that regulators need to stop the absurd practice of letting banks choose which affiliates are evaluated as a part of their CRA exam. One of my colleagues likes to say that when he was in school, he didn't get to say, I only want to be tested in science and math because I'm really not very good at reading. So I only want to be tested in these subjects. We don't feel like banks should be able to do the same sort of thing during their evaluation process, saying, you can only test this part of my enterprise, not this part. So there are more questions that we have and more concerns as well, like expanding what banks qualify as a small bank, because they say the evaluation process is too time-consuming. But we would push back and say that 98% of banks pass their evaluation each year, and yet we still see evidence of modern-day redlining, lending discrimination, and lack of investments in our communities. Again, we want to modernize CRA, but we want to do it in a way that keeps the original intent of the law sharply in focus. So now we're going to move on to the call to action. So what's at stake? So we see the ANPR as a nod in the direction of where the OCC wants to head. If you remember back to that earlier diagram, we are early on in the process, but we know that if we don't act now, it could potentially be too late. All of these examples indicate an attempt to weaken CRA under the guise of modernization. We fear that some of these proposed changes could result in less investment, economic development, and wealth building in LMI communities and census tracts that have been historically underserved if we don't engage in this process. Here at NCRC, we have a great research department that helped to do some forecasting based off of some data from the Federal Reserve to estimate what potential lending losses could happen if CRA is substantially weakened. These figures are national, so it's our expectation from anywhere from 10 to 20% of lending to LMI communities could be lost if CRA is weakened without that strong, firm focus of the law being applied. So what that can result and translate into potentially anywhere between $52 billion and $105 billion loss over 5 years. For Michigan, that could result in lending loss of up to specifically $1.8 billion over 5 years. So what can you do to be able to help engage in this process? You can submit a comment and tell the OCC that the proposals in the ANPR will weaken the CRA. CRA should only be modernized in ways that align with its original intent, which is to promote equal access to capital and credit for all communities. Because the ANPR is part of the rulemaking process, you'll be submitting a comment to the Federal Registry rather than sending a letter to an elected official. So while it's good to educate your congressmen, your senators about ANPR, and our office is working to do that, submitting a comment directly to the Federal Register is the best way to have the OCC see it and be engaged in that process. The comment period closes on November 19th. After that, comments will be reviewed, and then we expect a formal notice of proposed rulemaking to be released in a few months. After that, or when that happens, there'll be another shorter comment period, and then the final rule will be released, and any potential changes will go into effect. So for this campaign, we need as many comments as possible. We know that volume speaks a lot, and we know that the industry groups will begin to submit their comments very soon. Right now, there's about 220 comments that have been submitted. The majority are from NCRC members and also organizations that we've been working with to be able to help raise their voice and be engaged in the process. When you're thinking about this, I know that I breezed through CRA exams, potential changes from 31 different points. This is really complicated stuff, but one of the things that we like to remind people is that your comment can be as complex as you want them to be. And I'm glad to hear that you'll have multiple sample letters to be able to draw from. You can submit an individual comment or as a part of your organization. You can do both if you'd like. And we think that it's easiest if you set aside 15 to 20 minutes in the next few days to submit a comment before time gets away from us. I can't already believe that today is October 31st. This month has flown by. My birthday is October 1st, so I can't believe that I don't even know where time has went. So I really encourage you, if you can, to submit your comment by the end of the week. I know that especially getting sign-ons in an organization, it can take a little bit while longer, but the ultimate deadline is November 19th. So as next steps, following this call, CEDAM is going to send out an email with links to our Treasury CRA website where you can find information and resources. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then I believe also the sample comment that they've prepared for members. I would encourage you, if you can, submit your comment by the end of the day on Friday, just to get it out of the way, feel good before the weekend. Please be sure to personalize your comment to ensure that they are thoughtfully considered. Providing your all's perspective about how CRA impacts your work can be really powerful, and it can be important to be able to show how much lending and investment is taking on currently and how that could potentially be put in jeopardy if these changes are made. And then be sure to share the follow-up email with others in your network and encourage them to take action as well. As we joke, this isn't the most bright and shiny advocacy opportunity. A lot of times people get really intimidated by banking regulations, so it's all the more important that we help share with others that we know that are interested or that it relates to be able to speak out so that the OCC hears from committed individuals that are paying attention to this issue. So here are a couple resources that are also be in the follow-up email. The hashtag Treasure CRA campaign site includes our sample comment letter, blog post on the ANPR and on both the ANPR and analysis that our senior staff have done, as a lot of other information so that you can get background information to be able to help support your comment, or if you're just interested in finding out more. There's also a great report there that includes the figure that I talked about, the potential lending loss for Michigan. We have that broken down by congressional district as well, if you'd just like to see it so that you have a better understanding of what we're talking about. And then I can also be a resource. I'm available. My email address and phone number is there. If I can't answer a question, we have really dedicated, top-notch staff that this is CRA's is their life's work, and are really committed to helping to protect this rules and law. So if I can't answer a question, I can be able to put you into connection with someone that can. So that's all I had. I wanted to be able to open up for some questions and see if I can't help some people.
Awesome. Thank you, Mandy. It looks like you have one question from Cindy at the bottom, and I'm just flagging them under the questions. So if you just click on that tab, we can just kind of go through them.
Great. Thank you. Hey, Cindy, that's a great question. So you're asking if under the proposed changes, would banks be able to count loans to car dealerships? So what I meant by that reference is that banks are able to count loans that they make to small businesses. So if that small business is a car dealership, then yes, they would be able to count it. In the example I was giving, I was talking about the SBA's standards for how they define small business based on industry. So for car dealerships, the small business standard is 25 million. If you're running a dealership and you're making anywhere less than $25 million a year, you're considered a small business. If you compare that to other industries, or what many of us really think of as a small business, that sounds like a lot. Like you're not so much of a small business anymore if you're making 25 million. So where we're pushing back on that is that if banks need to only get credit for really investing in really small businesses that have trouble accessing credit in other ways, and that should be counted towards their CRA exam, not some of these other criteria. The CBA regulations make sense for government contracting. They don't make sense for investing and thinking about really the intent of CRA. Okay, and then someone asked if they can get a copy of the presentation. Yeah, you're welcome to share this. That's no problem. And Kate's asking if there are opportunities to advocate for micro-lending while they're possibly changing the rules. That's a great question. I think that, yes, there is an opportunity to be able to advocate for micro-lending because they're taking suggestions. And I would say that advocating that micro-lending be more meant, so let me step back from when I say that. Much of this process is looking to be able to help. The banks are saying, CRA is so complicated. I don't understand my exam. It's too much work. I don't know what's going to qualify. Why would I do things that don't qualify? I need more specific rules and examples. I need it to be easier to understand how to pass this test, even though 98% of them are already passing. So advocating for things that you think that are really important that are for LMI communities, and showing them as an example of something that does qualify or that could qualify, and pushing the OCC to be more specific about what does, or to consider the importance of these programs. I think this is a great opportunity to be able to make that voice heard. Because that is something that we see, and that would be something that would be lost if CRA was moved to more of a formula-based system. If they're only going to look at numbers, about their meeting their quota or their one ratio, microloans might be only a small proportion of their total investments, and it may be less of an incentive to invest in a specific community program like that, as opposed to doing larger deals for very large investment opportunities. Okay, the next question is, how do we find out how much local CRA activity is taking place so that we can reference it in our letter? It's a great question. So CRA activities, I would say that that is a tricky thing to be able to figure out. I can share I'll share a link, or ask for a link to be able to be shared about this report that we've used to be able to do some forecasting. To be able to find out exactly how much CRA lending is happening, that is usually dependent on looking into banks that operate in community-specific CRA exams, which gets a little bit complicated. What I would say is that knowing your organization's work, it can be really important if your organization specifically is maybe utilizing investments from banks to build affordable housing, or to run housing counseling services, or to if you're a CDFI, to be able to lend out for other opportunities. That's the best way to know how much is coming through your own organization. if you're not for sure about or your organization isn't interacting with banks in that way, I would say that potentially referencing this other report about the potential decreases in lending would be your next best opportunity without getting too far into the weeds. But I can also ask my colleague, Kevin Hill, who's our CRA manager, if he has a kind of a quicker and easier way to be able to find that information. Great. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if you do have any questions, again, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is A as in Apple, Wrinkle, W-R-I-N-K-L-E, @ncrc.org. And again, check out our, you can go to ncrc.org/treasurecra to find out all of our sample information, social media posts, reports, blog posts, everything that you need to be able to help spread the word and support your comment draft process. And if you've got specific questions, just let me know. But I really thank you all for joining today's call. This is such an important time, and to be able to make a really big difference in a law that is not well known but has a huge impact on LMI communities and for just redevelopment and investment in our communities in general.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mandy. We appreciate your time as well and all this extremely helpful information. And again, I want to echo thank you everyone who jumped on this call today. I know we did do this last minute, so we appreciate your sense of urgency with that. And please look up for our follow-up email that will include all of the resources that we talked about today, next steps, and the draft comment letter. So look for that, and thank you again. Have a great day. Thanks, Mandy.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.